So when I do these articles, one of the things I like is that I tend to learn a lot, and that's what I get as a reward for my time. A lot of what I knew about FM history was from these books by Lawrence Lessing, and he was I guess, a technical reporter at the time, and knew Armstrong and had done interviews with him, and I thought that was a really good way to say, okay, this guy knew the whole story, but he basically knew one side of the story. And when I looked at what did I know about history after reading the Lessing book, was that Armstrong conceived the theory of FM. I believe that FM was intended to improve audio quality. He didn't get any help from RCA. No one else worked on FM. And once he had the eureka moment, all the benefits were revealed. And Sarnoff fought the idea only for financial reasons, and that in the end, Armstrong's fight to defend FM led him to suicide. But I learned a lot, and found out that starting in 1902 was the first actual patent on an FM circuit for transmission of radio, and it was by this man named Cornelius Ehret. You can see the diagram and the printed patent, and in the description he even says it comprises further a method of modifying and varying the frequency of electro-radiant energy. I love that term. In a manner corresponding in accordance with the signals to be transmitted. It resides also in an additional step of modifying the energy to be transmitted and received by and in accordance with sound waves such as speech. So that was a big surprise. In 1902, I did find out it was never put into practice, but he really had the idea and a circuit that seemed believable. The next thing I came up with was that this is Vladimir Paulson, the inventor of the arc transmitter, and he had a reason. The arc transmitter, when other people were doing spark, was working by a continuous wave rather than the damped wave of a spark transmitter, and he needed a way, since it was a continuous wave, to make some change so that you could pick out a dot and a dash, and he came up with a way of modifying the frequency called frequency shift keying. You can see here that the arc transmitters were sizable contraptions, most of that for cooling. But what the FSK method did, I have an example here of what SOS would have looked like. The transmitter would be sending a continuous wave at the first frequency, F1 over there, and then the receiving station would be instructed to tune to frequency 2. And as the operator keys the transmitter, it shifts from F1 to F2, so that the receiver, hearing only F2, hears very clear dots and dashes. And if someone were to be on the F1 channel, they would just hear the blank spots where the dots and dashes were. So that came up as quite a surprise and seemed like a really clever idea. He used it for a while, but then eventually came on with other methods. But as the 1920s started and the broadcast era kicked in, AM transmitters were the new thing, and taking over the business, popping up all over the country. That's a basic elementary AM transmitter, where the movement of the diaphragm is controlling the amplitude of the wave, and basically had a lot of faults based on the type of equipment they had to work with, subject greatly to static, fading, interference, poor fidelity. And then as more and more stations popped up, the crowding of the broadcast band wasn't allowing enough for the bandwidth for all the people who wanted to have stations. But in 1916, then RCA's general manager, David Sarnoff, had made the original request that engineers bring him a radio music box to bring entertainment and news to the home. Well, that success now in the 1920s caused him to ask engineers now to bring him a little black box that would eliminate static and the other problems with AM radio. And that's when they really got started working on solutions to the problems with AM, and certainly found that it was a harder problem than anyone realized. There are also financial reasons to make those improvements. This is from a Chicago newspaper before FM was being put into practice in Chicago, saying that they would get 37 more days of good reception by switching to FM, and that over in the text there, since records since 1871 showed that that was the average 37 times a year, and at the last year at 43 days that it wasn't worth trying to listen to AM radio. So one of the people who took the challenge of trying to solve the static problem was Edwin Armstrong, already famous and an assistant professor at Columbia, and still working with Michael Pupin, certainly an inventor of renown on his own. And they took a long study of trying to find ways to filter out static, and eventually he was getting very frustrated with it, and it wasn't. He came to the conclusion that simple filtering would never do the job. This was his lab at Columbia, and but as he declared his war on static, he did come up with a method of using. It's hard to understand even after you've read it a couple of times. Two transmitters that are like strobing back and forth, and then a method to receive that he said would filter out the static. And they tried it at RCA's transmitters to go to send messages to Europe and back, and they found an improvement, but basically not enough for RCA to put it into practice. And then John Carson, an AT&T mathematician, analyzed the system and said that the only improvements really that happened were that Armstrong built a better transmitter than RCA had, and that was the beginning of kind of a battle between two prominent men in the field at the time. Carson, the mathematician who solved problems by finding mathematical proof, and Edwin Armstrong and his understanding of the physical concepts. So if Armstrong was Superman for us, then Carson was Lex Luthor, and he would just seem to come along with things that would frustrate what Armstrong was working on. And Armstrong later said that setback of basically papers being published to say he was wrong really took a shot at his confidence, and it took him at one point he said a decade to get back to having confidence to move ahead. But what they had to start looking at was, would there just be a better way to transmit radio? So information is added to the radio signal by modulating or changing the signal in accordance with the information. And at the time, they had three different ways that they could try to do that and make it work. One was amplitude, which has already got its problems; frequency, which was just shifting the frequency of the transmitter; and phase modulation, which they understood at the time but had no way to put into practice. So what looks like the basic circuit for an FM transmitter, if that were a condenser microphone in parallel with another condenser, a slight change would shift the frequency of the whole transmitter, and you could see the waveform being drawn over there. The idea and the problem that they were trying to confront with FM was not only to get a little better sound quality, but as the broadcast band, which was then considered shortwave, was filling up, they wanted to see if they could reduce the bandwidth for a broadcast station and get more stations jammed into that space. One of the reasons for needing to jam more in was that equipment to go to much higher frequency, shorter wavelength, just didn't exist at the time. So they started to make attempts, and one of the first was Frank Conrad and Donald Little at Westinghouse, and they used their work at KDKA to test a system they had of what we'll call narrowband FM. And the experiments they had, you'd have to wonder if they would announce that they're switching from AM to FM, but nobody had an FM radio, so they must have just transmitted to their own receiving station, and people had to listen to some kind of noise for a while. This is the first patent that Little had for an FM in 1926. And you can see his graph of the wavelength coming out and showing that as someone speaks into the microphone, the frequency is shifting in figure 2 there. And then this is Conrad's patent. He submitted in 1920, granted in 1925. But again, here comes John Carson in a 1922 paper to the IRE, Notes on the Theory of Modulation. He mathematically proved that narrowband FM just wouldn't work. He says that it is proved that the frequency modulation system using a spacing or compensating wave is inferior to the amplitude variation system, both as to the width of the frequency band occupied and as to the distortion of the signal waveform. So even though some people kept working on it, he pretty much mathematically proved that it just wasn't going to happen. For other reasons, RCA Communications Division, which was their system for transmitting point-to-point messages, was experimenting with FM to get more days of increased coverage and reduced fading. So they had a station set up in Riverhead, Long Island, Bolinas, California, and they were sending messages to Hawaii and the Philippines, and had mixed results, possibly still some of Carson's mathematics getting to them. But engineers, Harold Beveridge, Murray Crosby, and Clarence Hansel, who were the chief FM guys for RCA, invited Armstrong to visit their facility and to get his opinion on what he saw there in June of 1931. And Armstrong invited them back to his lab to see what he had been working on. A number of the patents that were granted around the time, this is Hansel's FM receiver of 1928. So this is prior to Armstrong's work. And you can see what looks like a pretty typical setup for an FM receiver. It's a superhet kind of circuit in the first parts, and then the limiter and what he calls an analyzer and detector instead of a discriminator. The volume control would be some kind of an AVC circuit. So what I had found out was in all of this time that there were, from 1902 to 1940, 120 patents on FM, 55 to RCA, 20 to Armstrong, 10 to Westinghouse, 6 to Western Electric, the others split between mostly individuals. But what really happened that Armstrong came up with, where he went to his physical concept way of thinking, was if the Carson method of analyzing the math said narrowband wouldn't work, well, what about wideband? And wideband certainly wouldn't have helped them with the station crowding problem. But as the technology was developing, there wasn't much reason they couldn't switch up to shorter waves and have more bandwidth to work with. So what he wanted to do is see if he did all that work, could he really achieve the improvement of removing static, and what would he need to accomplish to build such a system? Well, we can see you need wideband amplifiers, ultra-high frequency transmitters and receivers, and better fidelity equipment. And so his first version of the little black box that David Sarnoff was hoping for was this little black box. The whole room of his laboratory was in Columbia was set up as a combination FM transmitter and an FM receiver right next to each other. And in the Christmas of I think it was 33, he brought Sarnoff and RCA people over to see all of this and they got demonstrations over the next few months with Armstrong saying, you know, I'm locked in with you guys on a gentleman's agreement that I bring you my inventions first. What do you want to do with it? And at that point too, Armstrong was confident because he had a number of patents granted to him. These were all granted, if you look, on December 26, 33. So he felt that even though he was revealing this to Sarnoff, that it was his project, and with the results he was getting, he thought for sure that they would just jump right in. Well, there was some skepticism, and Sarnoff finally agreed to help out with further tests. And at the same time, they were doing early television tests from the top of the Empire State Building, and they knew that they'd be getting ready for a change in that equipment, and that test period would be done. So he allowed Armstrong to set up his equipment at the top of the Empire State Building, which was the new building at the time, and he would start to prepare the equipment to take over there. At the same time, other people were working on ideas to improve broadcast radio, and there was a whole series of Apex stations testing that I had never heard of before, with an effort to improve fidelity and go to slightly higher frequencies where they believed the interference and static would be less. And that came in 1932, and they did authorize these stations to broadcast, and eventually more would be added on. The one at the bottom, W2XR, is the one that became WQXR out of New York. So that was John Hogan's station. So this is where the testing was being done. The system they had was before the iconoscope tube was perfected, so they were using a scanning disc camera and an early kinescope receiver. This would be an example of one of the receivers that Zworykin is standing next to for the 1933 test. So those couple little sticks at the top of the end of the Empire State Building were it for something that was later infested with antennas. And this was the VHF transmitters that were being used for the TV broadcasts. And that's what our RCA said that Armstrong could use to transmit his FM signals. In 1991, this man, Thomas Blazowski, retired chief engineer in that room, spoke at the AWA conference, and he told of what it was like to work with Armstrong and his staff. He and his staff to work with Armstrong. They had a sign-in book. He would call in the morning to say that he'd be coming. He'd come after lunch. Well, lunch could be 2 or 3 o'clock. He would get there with plans of what he was going to do, sign in the book, and then when the time everybody would normally be going home, he'd be just getting warmed up. And the reward for the guys who stayed with him, he'd take the whole crowd out to dinner and tell them stories about the early days of radio. This picture is what he actually set up at the Empire State Building, and it's all the modulators for the VHF equipment. I was lucky to get what I thought's a pretty good picture of it. The whole circuitry was built on breadboards because as he would do tests, they would take measurements, he'd make changes. So he found this the most convenient way to build the equipment to achieve what he was trying to do. This was a later picture when they actually did multiplexing tests. So that on the left, you can see what looked like 3 additional identical units that were the different channels that were being multiplexed. And of course, if you're going to do FM tests, well, you kind of needed to have an FM receiver. So this was the FM receiver that existed at the time. This picture was taken in its second location at the basement of Harry Sadenwater, one of the RCA engineers, down in Haddonfield. I think they clocked that to be about 80 miles away from the Empire State Building. If you look on the left, that was a standard RCA VHF communications receiver. So that was the head end of it. And then in all those boxes were the IFs and limiters and amplifiers. The boxes, if you recognize them, those are Radiola 44 cabinets. That was already a couple-year-old product, so they probably had a lot of extra boxes around. So Armstrong built the equipment into those. And as it wraps around to the right, then you get to the audio amplifiers and the speaker. The first tests were to a receiving station they had set up out on Long Island. They had felt that wasn't a long enough distance test to keep everybody impressed, so that's when they moved this equipment to Haddonfield. It's all sitting on, you could see the bar rail. It's Harry Saddenwater's basement bar. So he wasn't having many parties after all this went in. And after the broadcasts from the Empire State Building that were received in West Hampton were concluded, this note was in the logbook for that day by Armstrong. W2XDG signed off. All tests performed according to Hoyle. This experiment concludes just 20 years of work on this problem. It is with the deepest gratification that I record here that my two oldest friends, George Burghardt and Randolph Runyon, old-timers who saw the genesis of regeneration, took part in the culmination of this work. An era as new and distinct in the radio art as that of regeneration is now upon us. After 10 years of eclipse, my star is again rising. Edwin Armstrong. Now, even though he was happy with the test and the results were there were certainly many problems with getting it into the industry. There were 27 million radios in people's homes that wouldn't be useful anymore. Everyone believed that FM would have limited range. They saw the complicated setup and said it's not going to work outside the laboratory, too complicated for home use, too expensive for home use. And what typically came up was that the most serious criticism of all was, if RCA wasn't getting into it, there must not be anything to it, because RCA had just such a lock on the whole industry at the time. So Armstrong is notified that the television testing is going to resume and that all of his equipment had to come out. Over the whole time, the lukewarm response from Sarnoff just caused Armstrong to get the idea that he had to go it alone if there was going to be an FM system developed. Sarnoff would tell him that repeatedly that, you just have to hold off. And if you think about it, Sarnoff had an immense project ahead of him in developing television. The man was creating an entire industry, and couldn't afford to actually set TV back by trying to incorporate work on FM at the same time. But Armstrong, who kind of saw his world in black and white when it wasn't gung-ho from Sarnoff, he decided he was going to go it alone. And to do that, he would have to get some kind of a transmitter going again, so that Randy Runyon, with his ham station in Yonkers, was going to be the site where this would happen. So he agrees to let Armstrong modify his apparatus for FM so that the testing could go on. This is a logbook from Runyon's station, which later got the X added to the call sign for experimental. So that was from January of 37 to October of 38. And this is what Armstrong built as the multipliers and power amplifiers for the station in Yonkers, which was going to broadcast on 110 megahertz. And these are the modulators. What they had done at the FCC was they allotted a couple of tiny slots for FM experimenting. If you look on the left, the AM broadcasting one was for those Apex stations. Then FM was for experimental stations, and then up around 117 is FM again. 116 is more allocations for AM Apex stations. The T's are for television. The G's are for government. A is for amateur. And that seems to have gotten the bulk of the allocations. So to say that he was going to go ahead on his own, Armstrong had to make a plan to disclose the FM project to the rest of the radio industry, not just RCA. So he was going to present a paper to the IRE, Institute of Radio Engineers, and he planned, without announcing it, that he would do a demonstration from Runyon station in Yonkers at the same time. And this was from the a reprint of the paper that he presented that night, a method of reducing disturbances in radio signaling. His patents usually were great understatements. He would just call most of the FM patents he just had down as radio signaling. But this was presented to the IRE in New York on November 6, 1935. And after reading the paper, Armstrong had to stall some because he got word by phone that the transmitter was having problems. And after they got patched up, the silence was broken with this announcement. This is W2AG broadcasting with frequency modulation on 2.5 meters. Just the 2.5 meters part of that statement would have really surprised most of the engineers at the time, because that was way shorter wavelengths than anyone was working with, and was believed to not be able to carry that distance. A lot of them believed it wouldn't make it across the street if there was a big building in the way. And the rest of the demonstration went on with music and sound effects that gave everyone an example of the clarity that FM would bring. And still, as people left, that same phrase was heard: if there is something to this, why isn't RCA interested? So Armstrong, with his plans to move ahead, purchases land in Alpine, New Jersey to build his FM station. He first applies for that experimental license to the FCC, and he's denied. Some believed at the time, and still do, that RCA stacked the deck against him, and they came back with a letter to Armstrong saying it was too experimental, that they wouldn't give him a license. So Armstrong had to play hardball, and he hired a Washington law firm who got to one of the commissioners at the FCC, and had to use his influence to get the experimental license. And that's a copy of the actual license. So in Alpine, New Jersey, the transmitter building was put up first, and this is the beginning of the work on the tower. And first parts of the tower going up, and then the final picture of the tower in that right time period. The specs. The top of the third arm is 410 feet above ground. Next one 320, then 240, and those arms span 150 feet. And since they're up on the Palisades, that gave them a height above sea level of 936 feet. This is a closer picture of the transmitter building and the call sign above the door. I hadn't been able to find many pictures of the interior of the building, but this was the cover picture on FM magazine in November of 1941, showing the equipment racks. And this picture that I got from the Columbia University archives is interesting because it says restricted on it. And I had found out in some of the papers from the Columbia University that Armstrong had been working on a government project to make FM radar equipment experimentally. And it says that this is, so I assume this is some of that equipment from that time. And it says that the resonatron cage is on the right. So I don't know what a resonatron is, but there it is. This is a more modern picture of the Alpine Tower, and this close-up shows you all the modern-day equipment that's renting space on the tower. But again, to use the tower for his experiments, he had to build more than one receiver. So he contracted GE to build 25 receivers at $400 each, which would be $7,000 each in 2020 dollars, or a total of $175,000 for 25 receivers. And because they were built up in Schenectady, they were nicknamed by the engineers the Schenectady sets. This is the front of one that was on display at in a contest at the radioactivity meet a couple of years ago. And this is the inside. The top rack is the power supply and final audio. The bottom rack has the RF and IF stages and detector. That's the chassis that's in the bottom rack, and the top box there is a module that has the RF amplifier, mixer, and converter, I think, are in that. This is the the patent tag that GE put on that. I counted something like 211 patents that GE felt between Armstrong's and ones that GE had. The whole bottom is on 3 of the tubes that are used in that receiver, the different patents that GE had on those. So certainly an FM receiver like that would have kept lawyers very busy for a long time. This is what the the layout in that receiver would have been. In the RF module, the RF amplifier and the oscillator mixer. Lower chassis has the first IF amplifier at 2 megahertz, second converter, 200 kilohertz amplifiers, and then the limiter and even another IF amplifier and a discriminator. Then we get into the audio stages. And again, it's starting to look like the basic block diagram, except for his overkill with IF amplifiers, I guess. But it's starting to look like what we'd understand as a FM receiver today. And then in 1940, the allocations were changed again, and that's when FM was assigned that block between 42 and 50 for experimental FM stations. And Runyon still ran his station as an experimental station up in that 116 to 119 area on the right. And another thing I didn't know before, and I found this out in the Popoli scrapbooks at the AWA, is that where TV stole the show at the 1939 World's Fair, the GE display had FM demonstrations. They'd received broadcasts from WOR's experimental station in New York, and had scheduled 2-hour sessions in each afternoon. Also, GE contributed some research by setting up 2 stations up near Schenectady to compare the service area of FM versus AM, and where they had equal powered transmitters and the same sites, you can see the difference in the service area covered by an FM transmitter versus a AM transmitter. Besides GE, one of the early believers in FM was John Shepard from the Yankee Network, and he was I guess they had several stations in that area, and he was an early proponent. And when Armstrong would be in Washington competing to get some of this bandwidth space, his outfit was the only one. He sent an engineer named DeMars, who was the only one who spoke up for Armstrong when the rest of the industry left him kind of hanging out there. And with Shepard, they put together the first FM relay in 1940, from starting in Yonkers and ending up at Mount Washington. So what they did was, when the Alpine station was broadcasting during the day so that Armstrong didn't have to sit there playing records, he had paid for a high quality phone line from WQXR in New York to send programming content to Alpine, and then he rebroadcast that. And then he said they came to the conclusion that the FM signal, if they relayed it, would be clean enough that they could come up with a system to stop renting phone lines from AT&T. So what they did was they originated a program in Yonkers, sent it on 117.190 kilohertz to Alpine, then out at 42.8 to and then kept relaying all the way till it finally got to Mount Washington. This is a list of as of March 15, 1940, the FM stations that were licensed and operating. Now, these are still experimental stations, so they weren't allowed to sell advertising. And you can see that a lot of them were affiliated with, well, the top one is Armstrong's and WOR's station. But then you see General Electric, Stromberg Carlson, the Westinghouse people, Zenith had stations. So there were believers in the industry outside of RCA. And then they had some authorizations for construction. So when I looked at it, all the timeline of wideband testing started with that Columbia University demonstration, moved to the Empire State Building, and then shrank down when Armstrong took over on his own to the Yonkers tests, and then grew again with the Alpine tests and the Yankee network coming on. And the other thing that I kind of discovered for myself was that Armstrong himself didn't realize all the benefits that he was going to get for his work, the improvements, because he wanted to get rid of static. He saw that he could get better fidelity, but he had really reduced static to an insignificant factor, eliminating interference by stations on the same frequency because of the capture effects, facilitating the broadband of audio, complete dynamic range reproduction, just even as simple things as receiving under a steel bridge, no big difference between day and night coverage, and then FM multiplexing. Without FM multiplexing, we never would have had Muzak. Some of the early license holders to build broadcast transmitters were REL, General Electric, and Western Electric, and those are the original manufacturers of broadcast receivers. And at the same time, Philco and others were starting to produce FM equipment without a license, figuring it was all going to end up in court. But Armstrong personally went to work publishing letters to the public saying that the only true FM and FM quality would be with equipment that he's licensed, that other people were cheating to get around it and not going to provide the quality product that the people deserved. Some of the receivers that came out, were converters, so that you could keep your radio and run an FM converter. This Scott actually is in the original band and would have just been plugged into a bigger Scott radio. So then the first commercial stations actually went on the air, and these were the first 5. The claim for actual first commercial station, W71NY, the WOR station, was based on the fact that even though others were on the air before them, they were the first to actually sell a commercial. So that's their claim to fame, was a single commercial for a watch. The call signs on these stations, so you see once they weren't experimental stations anymore, the X was taken out, and like WOR's one on the bottom was originally W2XOR. The X for experimental. The W2 was like a regional thing for New York. And when they removed that, the two numbers after the W are the second, the decimal places. Well, let's see, I could say that again. WOR, the W71NY, was broadcasting at 47.1. The Nashville one was at 44.7. So for some reason, they took the last 2 digits of the broadcast frequency, put a 4 in front of it, and then you have the transmission frequency, if that makes any sense. But finally, they came to their senses and just said, well, you can be WOR FM or you can be WGY FM or whatever, and got this crazy thing out of the way. I also found in the Popley scrapbooks the commercial rates for FM in the early days. So people did a lot of work to be able to sell a half hour of commercials for $50, and in prime time, I'm sorry, full hour at $50 in daytime, and $100 prime time for an hour's worth of sponsorship. So until it really caught on, they weren't doing this for a lot of money. So here's what I think I learned about the early history of FM from further research that didn't have anything to do with Lessing's book. That Armstrong had a number of failures that I never knew about. That his failures were in narrowband before his idea of wideband. That so many other people had worked on FM, and that a lot of Armstrong's research was built on the work on FM by RCA and others. But he fully gets the credit for the concept of wideband FM and bringing it to commercial realization. And that the benefits of FM likely surprised Armstrong's best expectations. And the battle with RCA is likely a more complicated story than just one big business against one man. So I end with this time period around 1940 in a commercialization. And we can see that the fight to get commercial FM was hard, but we'd see later on that the fight to keep FM alive would be even harder, and the path to a final victory in court would be longer and tragic. But on a happy note, again, when I was looking through the scrapbooks at the AWA, I found this little ode to FM. When the thunder rolls and rumbles, FM stills those groans and grumbles. When the lightning snaps and cracks, FM helps you to relax. In a thunderstorm like this, FM brings you silent bliss. And I'll sign off on that. Thanks to Gary Frost for helping me in his book on early FM. And if anyone wants a PDF of the article that was in the AWA review, you can send me a request at that email and I'll get it to you. And if anyone's still awake, I think I'm done.